Hello guys, welcome back to our anime explainer. Guys, please like the video and subscribe to my channel. Today is explanation of Dragon Prince Yuan Season 2 episode number 23 based on novel. So let's start. Zhu Yuan gazed at the young man in scarlet robes and chuckled. I am only retrieving what should be mine, that's not overbearing, right? The eyes of the young man narrowed slightly. Han Shan was indeed reckless earlier, but you've already taught him a lesson. Will you leave these Genesis jade pieces behind on my account? Although his tone was calm, there was no room for discussion, as if the matter had already been decided. If senior brother had stepped forward earlier, today's matter would not have happened. Said Zhu Yuan. As for now, I'm afraid that it's already too late. Zhu Yuan's eyes hardened as he flicked his finger. Genesis Chi instantly tore open the cloth bag. With a wave of his sleeve, another stream of Genesis Chi flowed out and caught all the falling Genesis jade pieces before returning to him. If he had lost today, Zhu Feng would not have spoken up for him. Hence, he would naturally not show any courtesy to such a biased person. You? Upon seeing Zhu Yuan directly snatch away the Genesis jade pieces, an act that clearly gave no face, Zhu Ying's eyes also hardened, iciness appearing in his gaze when he looked at Zhu Yuan. What an arrogant kid. Zhu Ying smiled in anger. Do you really dare to step over all our Xingju disciples' heads? Zhu Ying's words were malicious, instantly pitting Zhu Yuan against every Xingju disciple, evidently planning on making him face the fury of the crowd. Some Xingju disciples seemed to look over. They were naturally not feeling too good about Han Shan's miserably defeat, and it was difficult to avoid having opinions about the one who had beaten him. There seems to be a mistake in Brother Zhu's words. Before the challenge, Han Shan had already agreed to the terms, which every disciple here clearly heard. It is only reasonable for junior brother Zhu Yuan to retrieve his spoils of battle. So why the need to be so overbearing? A voice sounded all of a sudden. Unexpectedly, however, it was speaking up for Zhu Yuan. Zhu Yuan was somewhat surprised. He turned his head, and found that the one who had spoken was a faintly smiling thin young man. Zhu Yuan had a faint impression of the former. He was also a first-class disciple, and should be called Xiao Qing. He too was not from the Xingju continent, and was hence pretty popular amongst many non-Xingju disciples, making him a celebrity of sorts. After Zhu Yuan had displayed his strength, the opinion that he was someone who went through the back door had changed, and there were now people who were willing to show friendly gestures to him, though he honestly did not mind either way. Due to his popularity, Xiao Qing's words drew a series of verbal support from the non-Xingju disciples. Zhu Feng glared at Xiao Qing when he saw this, but he knew that there was no longer anything he could do to Zhu Yuan today. Hence, Zhu Feng frostily glanced at Zhu Yuan before retrieving his gaze. However, anyone could see that the former was not going to forget this. Zhu Yuan paid no attention to Zhu Feng's gaze, instead turning his head slightly to look at Xiao Qing, causing the latter to display a friendly smile. Since it was not appropriate for him to be too cold, Zhu Yuan nodded in response. Subsequently, his gaze swept across the area as he coolly asked, "Is there anyone else who wants to challenge me?" The entire mountain was silent. Which one of the second-class disciples would dare to respond after witnessing Han Shan's miserable fate? On the other hand, the first-class disciples merely watched like bystanders. Thus, no one responded to Zhu Yuan. Upon seeing this, he returned to his cultivation platform and lifted his head towards Chen Yuan, who was seated in mid-air. "Teacher Chen, may we begin the Genesis Mountain training?" Only at this moment did Chen Yuan return to his senses. He deeply looked at Zhu Yuan, evidently not expecting such an outcome. No wonder Mu Wuji was not worried about Zhu Yuan's first-class disciple status being stolen in the blink of an eye. It turns out that this kid was not as simple as he seemed. However, this kid likely did not know that defeating Han Shan would end up offending the Xingju disciples. There would only be more and more scuffled in the future. Chen Yuan wondered if Zhu Yuan would still be so cool and collected then. Chen Yuan's gazes flickered in thought for a moment before withdrawing it. His gaze then swept across the over 10,000 cultivation platforms on Genesis Mountain, as his calm voice sounded. "Activate Genesis Mountain." With a wave of his sleeve, a stream of Genesis Chi fell into the volcano-like mouth at the peak, seemingly activating a certain Genesis rune. BZZ. The surroundings immediately began to stir. Every disciple lifted their heads in astonishment as they watched the surrounding Genesis Chi flood towards Genesis Mountain like surging mist. The heavenly Yuan flower before them began to sway at this moment, absorbing the Genesis Chi in Genesis Mountain. In the end, its petals gradually opened as boundless Genesis Chi spouted out along with innumerable golden pollen. On Genesis Mountain, Genesis Chi sprayed from 10,000 flowers, a scene that was spectacular and beautiful. Zhu Yuan also raised his head as anticipation appeared in his eyes. He was dying to see just how effective the legendary Heavenly Genesis flower would be. Heavenly Genesis flower, after flower swayed on the titanic Genesis Mountain, golden light pulsing in circles. It made the flowers look as if they were made of gold, an exceedingly gorgeous sight indeed. A fragrance spread, filling the area. The roots of the flowers dug deep into the mountain, continuously absorbing the Genesis Chi within. Golden flower after flower gradually blossomed, the petals suddenly erupting as boundless and pure Genesis Chi sprayed out. Numerous golden pollen drifted within the pure Genesis Chi, giving it a strange fragrance. Such pure Genesis Chi. Amazement flitted across Zhu Yuan's eyes as he watched Genesis Chi stream out of the heavenly Genesis flower. He could sense that this Genesis Chi was purer than the normal Genesis Chi infused with golden pollen spread. Just as it was about to leave the cultivation platform, the runes on the platforms suddenly began to glow, transforming into a dome of light that sealed off the entire cultivation platform. This prevented the golden pollen Genesis Chi from drifting away. Thus, the golden pollen Genesis Chi continued to accumulate, gradually engulfing the figures seated in the platforms. Every disciple hurriedly closed their eyes at this moment, swiftly entering a state of cultivation, as they greedily devoured the golden pollen Genesis Chi. Zhu Yuan likewise also shut his eyes, the omni-python Chi in his Chi dwelling slowly beginning to stir. With a hiss, the giant golden python emitted a powerful suction force. The surrounding golden pollen Genesis Chi was immediately drawn towards him, transforming into streams of gold as it rapidly flowed into Zhu Yuan's body through his nose. Golden pollen Genesis Chi swam along his meridian channels and entered the Chi dwelling, before being swallowed by the giant golden python within it. The golden pollen Genesis Chi was swiftly refined, transforming into strand after strand of oming python Chi. The thing that surprised Zhu Yuan the most was that as the golden pollen Genesis Chi was refined, he could feel a faint burning sensation flowing within his Genesis Chi. When Zhu Yuan took a closer look, he saw faint, almost invisible impurities transforming into smoke and rising from his omni-python Chi. Meanwhile, the Genesis Chi in his Chi dwelling was becoming even more concentrated and purer. Zhu Yuan could not help but exclaim in amazement in his heart, "This heavenly Genesis flower is amazing." The pollen-infused Genesis Chi it produces can continuously concentrate one's Genesis Chi while training, while also burning away the impurities within. It may not show much effect in the short term, but the cumulative results over time was pretty darn amazing. When two Genesis Chi of similar grade clashed, the upper hand would go to the one that was more concentrated and robust. Hence, the flower would undoubtedly give that Sangshuan sect disciples an advantage. As expected of the sect that was once the strongest in Sangshuan heaven. Zhu Yuan could not stop praising. Regardless of whether it was the Genesis mountain he stood on or these heavenly Genesis flowers, unique methods were required to create them. Ordinary factions did not possess the qualifications to do so. By this point, Zhu Yuan was even more certain that only in that Sangshuan sect would he be able to truly dig out of all of his potential. Only here would he reach the divine dwelling stage in the shortest time possible, and gain the power to match the great Wu Empire's King Wu. Zhu Yuan's concentration gradually increased, as he began to immerse himself in his training. While this happened, golden pollen Genesis Chi continued to be spouted from the heavenly Genesis flower, making the cultivation platform grow even more dazzling. On another cultivation platform near to Zhu Yuan's, under the cover of golden light, Yao Yao leisurely watched the floating golden pollen Genesis Chi, no desire to absorb any at all. In her arms, Tuntun's mouth was wide open, the black light emerging from within causing its giant mouth to seemingly transform into a black hole. Black light pulsed. No matter how much golden pollen Genesis Chi spouted out from the heavenly Genesis flower, every last bit was ultimately eaten by Tuntun. In fact, Tuntun even began to feel that this was too slow, and hopped directly on top of the heavenly Genesis flower. Whenever the flower released its load, Tuntun would open its mouth and swallow, its eyes squinting in enjoyment as it happily wagged its tail. Every cultivation platform on the giant Genesis mountain was filled with golden light. The flickering golden light seemingly turning the entire mountain gold. Time gradually flowed, and 4 hours swiftly passed. After 4 hours, the spouting heavenly Genesis flower finally began to slow down as the glowing golden cultivation platforms gradually dimmed. However, everyone was still immersed in enjoying the sweet benefits, and could not possibly be willing to stop. Several disciples immediately retrieved a piece of Genesis jade and flung it towards the heavenly Genesis flower. The moment the Genesis jade touched the heavenly Genesis flower, a crack split open on the flower, swallowing the Genesis jade like a mouth. After swallowing the jade, the originally somewhat wilting flower began to shine dazzlingly as it began to energetically spout out more Genesis chi. Only now did the many disciples finally understood how precious the Genesis jade was. As long as one had enough Genesis jade, one would practically have an endlessly spouting heavenly Genesis flower, making one's cultivation speed faster than others. At this point, everyone could not help but feel some pity for Han Shan, because he had already lost all of this month's Genesis jade pieces. Zhu Yuan opened his eyes, falling into thought for a brief second, before fishing out a Genesis jade piece and feeding it to the heavenly Genesis flower. While training earlier, he had faintly felt the existence of the Alpha Origin heaven. Once he succeeded in sensing it, he would truly step into the Alpha Origin stage. After eating the Genesis jade piece, the flower once again began to tirelessly draw out the Genesis chi from the mountain. In the end, Genesis chi mixed with golden pollen covered Zhu Yuan's figure like a golden mist. With a single piece of Genesis jade, the heavenly Genesis flower would be able to continue for another 2 hours. Zhu Yuan's figure was just barely discernible in the golden pollen Genesis chi mist. His eyes were tightly shut, his spirit seemingly drifting in the murkiness. Something deep down inside of him could feel a very faint sensation, while his spirit slowly followed this faint feeling. He did not know how long this continued, until a certain moment when his spirit seemed to bump into something. With a jolt, Zhu Yuan's spirit violently returned to his senses as the world before him rapidly changed. What appeared in his sights was a mysterious world that was filled with the aura of primal chaos. The aura seemed to stir, giving off a feeling of ancientness. Is this place the Alpha Origin heaven? Zhu Yuan's spirit trembled as he was struck with a flash of understanding. Then was this primal chaos like aura the so-called Alpha Origin chi? Absorbing it would transform his chi dwelling, allowing it to gradually evolve into a divine dwelling. Joy flooded Zhu Yuan's heart. He knew that the moment his spirit entered this mysterious Alpha Origin heaven, he had finally truly stepped into the Alpha Origin stage. Use the spirit to receive Alpha Origin chi, and transform the world of the chi dwelling. Tiny wisps of what seemed to be the essence of the world drifted within the primal chaos like space, giving off an ancient aura. With regards to the mysterious world essence like chi, desire instinctively rose in Zhu Yuan. Zhu Yuan's spirit stood in this domain as his senses stretched forth. The domain seemed to be endless, making it impossible for him to find its boundaries. So this is the Alpha Origin stage, mumbled Zhu Yuan to himself. Only those that had stepped into the Alpha Origin stage would be able to sense the Alpha Origin heaven and enter with their spirit. I guess I'll have to use my spirit power to move the Alpha Origin chi here back into my body to begin transforming my chi dwelling. Evidently, the more powerful the spirit, the greater one's advantage in the Alpha Origin heaven. With a powerful spirit, moving Alpha Origin chi would be more effective, allowing one to surpass others in this aspect. At this point, Zhu Yuan laughed softly. This just so happened to be his strong point. Amongst those at the same level, he rarely encountered anyone whose spirit was as powerful as his own. With the exception of Yao Yao, of course. After all, not just anyone would possess a high-class spirit tempering method like the Primal Chaos Divine Grindstone Visualization method. After the baptism of the Saint Blood, Zhu Yuan's spirit had grown even more corporeal again, and was now at the perfect advanced illusory stage. All that was needed was an opportunity for him to smoothly reach the corporeal stage. Normally speaking, for those who did not practice any spirit tempering methods, when their Genesis chi cultivation reached the Alpha Origin stage, their spirit would also strengthen. However, this boost was limited, and most would only reach the initial illusory stage. In comparison to Zhu Yuan's perfect illusory stage, the distance between them was tremendous. Therefore, at the very least, Zhu Yuan's spirit would give him a huge advantage at the Alpha Origin level. With these thoughts in mind, Zhu Yuan decided not to waste any more time. His spirit power extended, seemingly transforming into numerous giant invisible hands that began to scoop up the tiny streams of world essence chi. Spirit power swirled around his spirit together with the now secured world essence, growing more abundant as wisp after wisp continued to be collected. After an incense stick of time, the flowing world essence chi around him had thickened to strands. By this time, all of the world essence chi in the vicinity had already been collected. Ordinarily speaking, an initial illusory stage spirit would only last about an incense stick of time in the Alpha Origin heaven before being forcibly kicked out due to exhaustion. However, Zhu Yuan was clearly not a part of this group. He could feel that his spirit power was still sufficient, and thus began to drift forward, finding another spot that was abundant in world essence chi, and begin the collection process again. As such, the following period of time was spent happily collecting world essence chi, only stopping when his spirit began to tire. By now, the world essence chi swirling around Zhu Yuan's spirit was akin to tiny twisters, a pretty impressive sight indeed. Zhu Yuan nodded as he gazed upon the fruits of his hard work in satisfaction. With a thought, his spirit began to leave the Alpha Origin heaven. The invisible spirit herded the world essence chi towards the pull of the physical body. Genesis Mountain. At this current moment, the dazzling golden light on the numerous cultivation platforms had already gradually dimmed. Stalk after stalk of heavenly Genesis flower drew back their leaves and petals, the golden glow they previously gave off now much duller, a sign that they had used up all their energy. The many disciples sat on the cultivation platforms, their faces overflowing with joy. The training session had benefited them substantially, and most importantly, they had finally truly tasted the wonderfulness of entering the Zhangshuan sect. The outside world was definitely unable to provide such a unique training method, because ordinary sects completely lacked the means. Yao Yao stretched her back, boldly displaying the amazing curves of her slender waist that drew several barely detectable glances. As a first-class disciple, Yao Yao's fame and reputation amongst the new disciples was even greater than Zhu Yuan's. Many were already secretly trying to find out more information about her since yesterday. After all, Yao Yao was just too beautiful. In addition, her cold and distant demeanor made it such that ordinary people would not dare to approach. Only those first-class disciples of the same status, with ability worth bragging about, would dare to have designs on her. Yao Yao chose to completely ignore these gazes. With Tunton again in her arms, she looked towards Zhu Yuan's cultivation platform, and a soft cry of surprise suddenly sounded from her red lips. Oh! She had sensed some strange activity from Zhu Yuan's spirit. His spirit has entered the Alpha Origin heaven. Has he finally stepped into the first layer Alpha Origin stage? Yao Yao was somewhat surprised. The moment Yao Yao's words faded, a strange noise suddenly sounded in the sky. Numerous disciples lifted their heads in bewilderment, only to watch in astonishment as strands of world essence chi began hanging down from high up the sky like a tassel. This is Alpha Origin chi. The sight of the world essence chi caused numerous disciples to cry out in surprise. Someone has just stepped into the Alpha Origin stage. Everyone was somewhat stunned. The scene before their eyes was very familiar. It occurred when someone reached the Alpha Origin stage, linked to the Alpha Origin heaven, and brought back Alpha Origin chi. In other words, someone had ascended to the Alpha Origin stage. However, there was someone who had yet to reach the Alpha Origin stage amongst them. It's Zhu Yuan. Someone quickly regained his wits. Who else was there who had to reach the Alpha Origin stage besides Zhu Yuan? Thus, surprised gaze after gaze was cast in Zhu Yuan's direction. Sure enough, they saw that his eyes were still closed, the world essence chi hanging down from the sky surrounding his body as it streamed in. He's already caused such a ruckus at the quasi-Alpha Origin stage. Wouldn't that mean he'll be going to turn the world upside down after he steps in the first layer Alpha Origin? Several Xingju first-class disciples could not help but cheekily joke when they saw this. In between their words was mockery and arrogance. One of the first-class disciples smiled as he asked Lu Feng, when you reached the Alpha Origin stage, how long did the Alpha Origin chi you brought back last? Lu Feng's face was impassive as he answered, 935 breaths. This period of time started when the Alpha Origin chi first appeared and ended when all of it entered the chi dwelling. It would normally be over pretty quickly, and was hence counted in breaths. When one reached the Heaven Gate stage, the Genesis chi dashing past the Heaven Gate was measured in feet. At the Alpha Origin stage, it was measured based on how much Alpha Origin chi was brought back. The more abundant the Alpha Origin chi, the longer it lasted. Awesome! Praised the other first-class disciples when they heard Lu Feng's answer as their faces lit up with admiration. The first time I brought back Alpha Origin chi, it only lasted for 400 breaths. Me too. Looks like brother Lu Feng's spirit is pretty strong too. Lu Feng chuckled softly. I had a fortunate encounter in the past, and my spirit just happened to reach the mid-illusory stage when I ascended to the Alpha Origin stage. No wonder. The crowd nodded. Most of them were only at the initial illusory stage, and naturally could not compare to Lu Feng. Hee. I wonder how long the Alpha Origin Qi Zhu Yuan brought back will last. They grinned as they looked towards Zhu Yuan, as if something amusing was going to happen. Zhu Yuan's victory over Han Shan had in a certain manner made the Xingju disciples lose face. Hence, they were naturally keen on gloating over him. While the crowd was whispering, Jiyu Hongyi also looked over. The first time she had brought back Alpha Origin Qi, it had lasted 1,000 breaths, a record even longer than Lu Feng's. Hence, she too was interested to find out what the one who had overwhelmed Han Shan could achieve. Besides them, even the Qiaoqing and the other non-Xingju disciples, whom had spoken up for Zhu Yuan earlier, also cast their gazes over. In mid-air, Chen Yuan also turned his attention towards Zhu Yuan. Under the numerous watching gazes, Zhu Yuan's eyes remained shut as the world essence Qi continued to descend. Time swiftly passed breath by breath. A stream of world essence seemed to have been squeezed out of some unknown domain, appearing in the sky above Zhu Yuan, before endlessly falling onto him. Under the attention of countless gazes, time swiftly flowed. 100 breaths faded away in an instant. Every gaze was unblinking as they continued to count the time. 100 breaths, 150 breaths, 200 breaths. It soon reached 300 breaths. However, the descending stream of world essence was still as clear and bountiful as before, showing no signs of waning. 400 breaths. 500 breaths. By this time, the expressions of the first-class Xingju disciples had turned a little ugly. This timing had already surpassed their own. They could not help but sourly remark, he does have some ability. Only Lu Feng remained impassive, not even the slightest ripple visible on his face. World essence Qi continued to fall as time continued to flow. It soon reached 700 breaths. Low cries of surprise began to ring out in the mountain. This timing had already surpassed 90% of the people here, and even some first-class disciples would be left far behind in the dust by this number. I can't believe his spirit cultivation is so high, said Xiao Xiao in amazement. Lasting this long was clearly out of his expectations. Lu Feng frowned slightly. This guy. He had detected that even at 700 breaths, the Alpha Origin Qi that descended from the sky still showed no signs of stopping. It looked as if the reserves were still ample. 750 breaths. 800 breaths, 1,000 breaths. The entire Genesis Mountain had fell deathly silent. The Xingju first-class disciples swallowed their saliva and looked towards Lu Feng, seeing the latter's brows now tightly furrowed together. Zhu Yuan had already surpassed his record. The thing that made Lu Feng's expression sink the most was that even at 1,000 breaths, the falling stream of world essence still showed no indications of weakening. Several of the first-class disciples could not help but blurt out, just how strong is his spirit? How can he bring back so much Alpha Origin Qi on his first time? Lu Feng's gaze flickered for a moment. He stared deeply at Zhu Yuan and indifferently said, interesting. How interesting? Jiyu Hongyi's eyes also glimmered faintly, her voice filled with interest. She had realized that she could no longer estimate the extent of his abilities. The young man, who had originally been nothing special, in her eyes now seemed a little unfathomable. As soft gasps sounded across the mountain, the Alpha Origin Qi continued to fall, lasting all the way till 2,359 breaths under everyone's stunned gazes. Numerous disciples looked to each other, not knowing what to say. Even now, the Alpha Origin Qi they could bring back was far from being able to match this number. And yet, Zhu Yuan had achieved it on his very first try. Although this did not determine one's future accomplishments, like how tall one's Genesis Qi could reach at the Heaven Gate stage, it would at least give Zhu Yuan the absolute advantage during the Alpha Origin stage. A single round for him would be equivalent to several rounds for them. How could they match his efficiency? Lu Feng let out a long breath, his eyes turning as deep as the night. He looked towards the stunned Xingju disciples in the vicinity, and said in a nonchalant voice, no need to make a mountain out of a molehill. His spirit is likely stronger than ours, because he practices a spirit-tempering method. I'll admit that he does have ambition, training both Genesis Qi and spirit. Though ambition is good, one should only do what's within one's capabilities. Dual cultivation would result in having to split one's efforts and attention, making him unable to be as focused as us. Therefore, when the comes where we step into the diving dwelling stage, he will likely still be struggling at the alpha origin stage. Likewise, how long he lasted doesn't mean anything, because the most important factor is still how many Genesis Chi he managed to create, the true representation of one's foundations. The other disciples nodded in agreement after hearing this. It was indeed as he had said, dual cultivation might give one the ability to utilize multiple strategies, but it also meant difficulty in achieving proficiency in both. Thus, it may be better to focus on one like themselves. At the very least, if they could reach the divine dwelling stage, though their spirits would not be as strong as Zhu Yuan's, they would still be able to easily finish him off in a fight. As for the Genesis Chi stars, they were tiny specks of light created from the amalgamation of Genesis Chi and Alpha Origin Chi, and looked similar to stars. Hence why they were called Genesis Chi stars. Someone asked, how many Genesis Chi stars did senior brother Lu create on your first try? I believe I managed slightly over 20. I only had a little more than 50 on my first try. Lu Feng smiled faintly. The others once again secretly wet their lips. Having over 50 Genesis Chi stars, after reaching the Alpha Origin stage, was enough to show the abundance of Lu Feng's Genesis Chi. Jiyu Hongyi's gaze concentrated on Zhu Yuan. She too understood that although how long the Alpha Origin Chi lasted showed the strength of his spirit, the most important thing to the Alpha Origin stage was the number of Genesis Chi stars. I made 63 back then. I wonder how many Zhu Yuan will create. While the entire mountain was in shock due to Zhu Yuan, the person himself was completely unaware, because he was currently viewing the interior of his Chi dwelling. As the robust Alpha Origin Chi flowed into his Chi dwelling, enormous changes began to appear. Zhu Yuan's Chi dwelling had originally given off a blood-red luster, but as more and more Alpha Origin entered, the Chi dwelling gradually began to expand, growing even larger. Faint ancient patterns began to appear. Zhu Yuan could clearly feel the Alpha Origin Chi enlarge his Chi dwelling, allowing for more Genesis Chi to be stored. In addition, when the Alpha Origin Chi began to mix with the Genesis Chi within, a strange but wonderful mist began to rise, condensing into specks of light that seemed akin to stars in the sky of the Chi dwelling. These light dots were filled with pure Genesis Chi, while a barely discernible python-like mark could be seen on each one. My Genesis Chi is being consumed. Zhu Yuan felt the Genesis Chi in his Chi dwelling rapidly deplete as each Genesis Chi star appeared. Is this the mark of the Alpha Origin, Genesis Chi stars? Zhu Yuan carefully absorbed the star-like dots. These Genesis Chi stars symbolize the Alpha Origin stage, and were extremely useful. In battle, the Genesis Chi from detonating these Genesis Chi stars would possess even more explosive and destructive power than usual. Genesis Chi transforming into Genesis Chi stars was undoubtedly an evolution of sorts. Zhu Yuan mumbled in his heart. It's said that divine dwelling experts have a whole world made from Genesis Chi in their Chi dwelling, which is populated by millions of stars. In a fight, they can turn the stars into Genesis Chi at any time at a far more effective rate than any Alpha Origin. At this point in time, 146 Genesis Chi stars had been created in his Chi dwelling. I've heard that the greater the number of Genesis Chi stars at the 9th layer Alpha Origin stage, the higher quality the divine dwelling formed. Zhu Yuan was eager to find out how many Genesis Chi stars he would have when he advanced to the divine dwelling stage. With such thoughts in mind, he once again looked towards the stars in his Chi dwelling, before withdrawing from his state of cultivation. On the cultivation platform, Zhu Yuan's tightly shut eyes finally opened, immediately feeling the countless gazes on his body. Hey! A clear voice sounded. Zhu Yuan raised his head, and saw Jiyu Hongyi staring at him with bright eyes, as she directly asked, how many Genesis Chi stars do you have? When Jiyu Hongyi's clear voice sounded, various emotions appeared within the countless gazes that were currently focused on Zhu Yuan. The amount of Alpha Origin Chi Zhu Yuan brought back was something to be envious about. However, the amount only showed that Zhu Yuan's spirit cultivation was high. The most important thing to the Alpha Origin stage was still the number of Genesis Chi stars. From a certain point of view, it represented the amount of Genesis Chi one had. Of course, this did not mean that the more Genesis Chi stars the more powerful someone would be. There were still various other factors to consider, such as the grade of these Genesis Chi stars and etc. Even so, at the end of the day, having more Genesis Chi stars would give one an advantage. Zhu Yuan was slightly taken aback by Jiyu Hongyi's directness. Soon after, he shook his head and said, no comment. The number of Genesis Chi stars was a rather personal thing, and would allow another party to estimate one's strength. Although Zhu Yuan did not really mind, he felt that there was really no benefit to revealing it here besides maybe causing some eyeballs to pop out of their sockets. Therefore, he cleanly rejected. Zhu Yuan's words immediately caused a series of noises indicating displeasure. You? Ji Yuhong's eyes widened slightly, somewhat peeved as she glared at Zhu Yuan. Given her status, she was seldom rejected by those of the opposite sex. TCH, it seems that he's too ashamed to tell us. Several of Ji Yuhong's admirers sneered. Yeah, he likely doesn't dare to say it. After all, he had brought back so much Alpha Origin Chi earlier and probably wasted it all. What a pity. Others began to chime in. They clearly believed Zhu Yuan's reluctance to answer was due to a lack of confidence. However, Zhu Yuan's expression remained calm in the face of their words. If anyone wants to know how many Genesis Chi stars I have, won't you find out once you challenge me? The numerous disciples froze before cursing out loud. Everyone present knew that you would have to pay 30 Genesis jade pieces per challenge. The price was far too high. Hence, they could only inwardly shake their heads. After seeing Zhu Yuan's battle prowess earlier, they no longer dared to underestimate this first-class disciple, who seemed the easiest to bully on the surface. Most importantly, Zhu Yuan was now even stronger than before, because he had now also stepped into the first-layer Alpha Origin stage. Zhu Yuan was a little disappointed that no one was interested. It seems that plan of winning Genesis Jade crystals using this method was not going to work. After the first time, these people won't fall for the same trick twice. As for the first-class disciples, they were unlikely to act before getting a proper grasp of his abilities. Ji Yuhongyi gritted her pearly white teeth. In the end, she could only glare at Zhu Yuan. Although she was curious about how many Genesis Chi stars Zhu Yuan had, there was no grudge between them, and thus no reason for her to challenge him. Is he using this method to attract my attention? Ji Yuhongyi blinked a few times. There were after all too many young men who adored her, amongst which were no lack of individuals that tried various methods to catch her eye. However, such thoughts were quickly discarded, because she had just glanced in Yaoiro's direction. After a brief comparison, she could only bite her red lips. Even someone as prideful as herself had no choice but to admit that this mysterious and distant girl was truly one of the most remarkable beauties in this world. She did not know the former's relation with Zhu Yuan, but one could not deny that they were very close. If not, they would not be living together. In the air, Chen Yuan looked down from above, his indifferent gaze sweeping across Zhu Yuan before shifting towards the numerous disciples as he said, today's training session shall end here. In the future, all of you will need to train in Genesis Mountain every day. With regards to this, everyone nodded in approval. Genesis Mountain was just too effective, and after personally experiencing its wonders, they were naturally dying to train in it every day. Although Genesis Chi cultivation is important, do not neglect your Genesis techniques. You may head to the Outer Mountains Hidden Scriptures house to rent Genesis techniques. However, the higher-tier Genesis techniques will cost more to borrow. Of course, everything will be paid in Genesis Jade. There are also many instructors in the Hidden Scriptures house whom you may approach if you're having any difficulties with the Genesis techniques you selected. Similarly, this service will require Genesis Jade, and the better the instructor, the higher the cost. Chen Yuan's words made the heads of the numerous disciples swim. Why was Genesis Jade needed for everything? They had originally not thought much about the Genesis Jade, but today, its importance had been deeply carved into them. Without Genesis Jade, even the time they could use on the heavenly Genesis flower would be less than others. It seemed that 30 Genesis Jade pieces per month was really not enough. At the sight of the pained faces of the crowd, Chen Yuan instantly knew what they were worrying about. Hence, he continued to speak, as for Genesis Jade, besides the 30 given to you guys every month, you may earn more by completing various tasks from the task pavilion. They give out all kinds of missions such as patrolling, night watch duty, hunting various Genesis beasts, searching for Genesis resources and many others. As long as you complete such tasks, you will receive Genesis Jade as a reward. Only after hearing this did everyone breathe a sigh of relief. So there was another method to obtain Genesis Jade. If not, their days would have to be spent very frugally. Zhu Yuan's eyes brightened. He was not interested in going to the task pavilion to take on any assignments for the time being. After all, he had won 30 Genesis jade pieces from Hanshan. Therefore, he was more interested in the Outer Mountains' hidden scripture house. Although it was the Outer Mountains, it was still the Tsangshuan sect, and the Genesis techniques found within should not be too low grade, right? Amongst the Genesis techniques I have, only the Great Wind and Thunder technique is at the Little Heaven level, and even then, it just barely makes the cut. All the other techniques have somewhat fallen behind my cultivation, including Dragon Tablet Hand. Mumbled Zhu Yuan to himself. As his strength rose, there was less and less use for the previous Genesis techniques he had learnt. In fact, he had been mostly relying on the Omni-Python Chi's Genesis techniques in battle, such as the magical Python scales. Hence, he urgently needed a few Little Heaven tier Genesis techniques to bolster his arsenal. Unfortunately, techniques at this level were difficult to come by, which could be seen for how hard he had to work in order to obtain a single Great Wind and Thunder technique. Looks like I'll be dropping by the Hidden Scriptures house. While Zhu Yuan was talking to himself, Chen Yuan had finished his explanations and began to leave. The atmosphere of Genesis Mountain relaxed as chatter began to fill the place. Ji Hongi swept a glance at Zhu Yuan, no intentions of talking to him as she turned around and began descending the mountain. She was clearly still a little miffed at Zhu Yuan's rejection. Lu Feng also headed down the mountain, with numerous Xingju disciples crowding around him. His expression was indifferent, but when he walked past Zhu Yuan, he paused and said, "I am not too interested in you, but I am an acquaintance of Hongi's family, and hence hope that you will not become too friendly with her, while also giving her a little more respect. I do not intend to cause trouble for you, but I also hope that you do not come looking for it." Without waiting for Zhu Yuan's reply, the former seemed to disdainfully brush past the latter. The Xingju first-class disciple entourage fearlessly swept their gazes at Zhu Yuan, as if slightly pitying the fact that he had drawn Lu Feng's attention. Zhu Yuan paid no heed to their gazes, frowning slightly as he gazed at Lu Feng's back. The superior airs these Xingju disciples put up was really very unlikable. "I too hope that you will not provoke me." His eyes narrowed slightly, a certain sharpness appearing no his slightly pursed lips. "Or else, my fist will not give any face to your identities as Xingju geniuses, 100 Fragrances House." This was an eatery in the Outer Mountains area. For the numerous Outer Mountain disciples, it was a place with extremely good service. The wide range of delicacies available was only second to the high-grade ingredients used. Not only would the food satisfy your appetite, it would even benefit your cultivation. Of course, one needed to pay Genesis Jade to enjoy the services here. Hence, extremely few disciples could afford to come here during the initial period. At this current moment, Zhu Yuan had brought Yao Yao, Tunten, Shen Wanjin, Xiao Qianxian and the rest of the Kangmang geniuses here, and booked a table to celebrate his breakthrough to the Alpha Origin stage. The more important reason was that the moment they reached its doors, Tunten suddenly charged in as if it had gone mad, making it practically impossible to stop this little creature. "He, I saw this place yesterday, but did not even dare to step in. Thanks to little Yuan bro, I can finally have a taste of its delicacies today." Shen Wanjin chuckled, his face practically gleaming. After arriving at the Tsangshuan sect, everyone had become rather poor, no longer the doted and pampered geniuses they were before. Hence, they were initially unable to afford coming to such a place. Zhu Yuan smiled, a smile filled with raw physical pain. When he ordered earlier, he had discovered that the main component of practically all of the dishes were grade 4 Genesis beasts. Even for the soup, numerous rare Genesis resources were used to enhance its flavor. While at the channel opening stage, he had once consumed the royal clan's 9-beast soup. Compared to this place however, the 9-beast soup was akin to a little shrimp in the ocean. Of course, the better the food, the higher the price. A single meal had cost Zhu Yuan 10 Genesis jade pieces. When his thoughts reached this point, he could not help venomously glare at Tunten, which was currently drooling with its mouth wide open, and its tail happily wagging from side to side. Little Yuan bro was so cool today. Let's see if they still dare to look down on our Kangmang continent. By the side, a rather pretty young girl with a goose egg-shaped face grinned widely. She was called Shureishi and her clan was also an overlord in the Kangmang continent. The others also smiled and nodded. One could see that they had completely put down their previous mental block and started to truly treat Zhu Yuan as their core. Over the past 2 days, they had clearly felt how intense the competition was in the Tsangshuan sect. If they did not group together, they would only be bullied and trampled on by others. As the only 2 first-class disciples from the Kangmang continent, Zhu Yuan and Yao Yao were the strongest amongst them. Thus they naturally became the central pillars of the group. Zhu Yuan looked at everyone and said, Shen Wanjin told me that the other disciples have begun forming their own groups and factions during the past 2 days, while we Kangmang disciples were the only ones that were left out. On hindsight, it was due to me that you guys were implicated. He softly chuckled, before continuing, I'm honestly not too interested in forming a group, but since we are all from the Kangmang continent, when possible, I will naturally try to take care of you guys. Shen Wanjin lifted his cup and declared, these words of little Yuan bro are enough already. As he spoke, he suddenly nudged the silent Xiao Tianxian beside him. The latter's expression was somewhat rigid. He lifted his head and glanced at Zhu Yuan, hesitating somewhat before he finally said, before we left the Kangmang continent, my father told me that he has sent an envoy to the great Zhu Empire to seek an alliance. Zhu Yuan was slightly taken aback. It was hard to believe that the city lord of Saint Romain's city had done such a thing. One must know that Saint Romain's city was one of the strongest factions in the Kangmang continent, and was not much weaker than the Great Wu Empire. The reason why Xiao Tianxuan's father had done so was likely because he knew about the grudge between his son and Zhu Yuan. Was this how the former planned to resolve it? What charisma, he's an amazing man. Zhu Yuan secretly thought to himself. The Saint Romain's city lord had chosen to ally with the Great Zhu Empire because of him. Although Saint Romain's city was a long distance away from the Great Zhu and Great Wu empires, and would not be able to do much if something were to happen, Saint Romain's city would still be able to function as a threat of sorts, ensuring that the Great Wu Empire would have to watch its back if it were to try anything with the Great Zhu Empire. Thus, Zhu Yuan could not help but be grateful to the Saint Romain's city lord's actions. Zhu Yuan could not help but sigh inside. No wonder Saint Romain's city was growing increasingly powerful under the city lord's leadership. Zhu Yuan picked up his cup and was silent for a moment before he lifted it toward